Well, welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. My guest today not only has done a Patterson-led fair, he has continued in Fairland till the current day. I met him this weekend at the Canterbury Renaissance Fair here up in Oregon. Here to talk about his evolution along with the evolution of the fair is my good friend, John Breen. John, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Dan.
I'm going to start you off with the traditional first Fair Folk at Work question, which is, who was the person who first told you about fair and what did they say to get you out there?
Well, I actually stumbled across the Renaissance Fair by accident when I was still in junior high school. I saw on the television news the Renaissance Pleasure Fair had experienced a flash rainstorm and was completely flooded. And the news covered it, and I was fascinated. Also, my junior high English teacher had a poster on the wall for the fair. And so these two things hit together at the same time, and I became interested. And I didn't know that I'd seen the poster, but I didn't realize this was a real thing until I saw the news article. And so I nagged my parents until they took me at 14 out to the Agoura Hills, and we went to the fair for the first time.
Can I ask where you went to junior high?
I attended junior high in Rialto, California, which is a little west of San Bernardino.
Do you recall what attracted you to the concept of the fair?
Well, I at that point had really gotten into Shakespeare. I was a theater kid. And so the idea that you could be in a Shakespearean environment that was 360 degrees all around you was really appealing to me. I was very into the Zeffirelli Shakespeare films by that point. I had seen, Romeo and Juliet, of course, and Taming the Shrew, and just was completely hooked. So I badgered my parents until we went to Agoura. And I had actually met actors that did fair already. I'd already done several plays, including a musical production of Christmas Carol called Scrooge. There was a lady in that cast whose name was Linda Underhill. She was in that cast as the ghost of Christmas Present. Lo and behold, there she was at the fair. And by the end of the day, I knew that this was the place that I wanted to spend every moment that I could. And as I was on my way out that day, there was a little booth up toward the front gate that had a big banner on the front that said, "Would you like to be more involved?" And I did. I said, yes, I would. And so I went up to that booth and I said, yes, I would like to be more involved. And this young lady behind the counter said, well, I've just started this new organization called the Friends of the Fair. And for the modest sum of $20 per year, you will get a quarterly newsletter, a little pewter pin, and a one-day ticket to the fair every year. And I said, here is my $20. And she said, my name is Sue Honor. And that was how I met Sue. By the next year, that one-day pass was not going to be enough for me. So I had contacted Sue and said, is there anything else I could be doing? And she said, well, you could come out to workshops. And I said, well, I could, except I don't really drive. And I don't think I can badger my parents into driving in like 2 hours out there to the Agoura Hills every week. It's bad enough that they have to drive me to practices and rehearsals. So what she did was she went around to every workshop that had a handout. And she gathered them all together and stuck them in a manila envelope and mailed them to me. So I probably had the very first Renaissance Fair correspondence course. So I had my fair costume handout. I had my Mother Wit's book of language. I had all of those things when I was a little kid.
Can I stop you for a sec?
Certainly.
I'm actually intrigued by your parents. Were they theater people too, or were they just accommodating your passion for theater?
A little of both. My mother was very accommodating of theater. My dad had been an actor in high school. He was kind of a fan of cowboy poetry. He was kind of an outdoorsy guy, but he loved the work of like Robert Service, favorite poet. He was not like necessarily a fan of Shakespeare, but he always thought that it was neat that I was. And he had a wicked wit. He thought that we should do a dinner theater and we should do Sweeney Todd and serve meat pies. He thought that would be a great idea.
Well, it's really great that your parents were pro fair, if not necessarily of the fair, if that makes sense.
I remember years later when I became like incredibly deeply involved in fair. I remember I was talking to my dad on the phone and my father asked me, he said, "So do they pay you to do the fair?" And I said, "No, no, Dad, they don't." And he says, "Well, do they give you a costume?" And I said, "No, I have to provide my own clothes." He goes, "Do they feed you?" I said, "No, no, I buy my own food." He goes, "They don't pay you. You got to buy your own clothes and you got to buy your own food. Are you enjoying it?" And I said, "Yes, more than anything." And he goes, "Do you enjoy it to the level of the money, time, and trouble you are investing?" And I said, "Yes, even more so." And he said, "Well, then I guess it's good." But then we had almost that exact conversation about 10 years later. And by that point, I was a director. I was writing for the fair. They provided my wardrobe. My lunch was bought for me. You know, it was that kind of thing where by that point, I had reached a point where I didn't have to worry about things anymore. I was being taken care of. We had almost that exact conversation. And he said, "Are you still enjoying it now?" The trouble is, sometimes when you get to that point where the thing that gives you pleasure becomes your job, it stops giving you pleasure. He goes, "Is it still giving you pleasure?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And he goes, "Good, then you've won." And that to me was the best lesson ever. So there it is.
What was his day job? Hmm.
He was a pipe welder, which is probably one of the hardest kind of welding there is, because you're welding with acetylene gas and you're in constantly changing angles because you're welding pipe and
Right.
the angles are constantly changing. You've got to adjust for flow and temperature, and your weld has to be perfect because you're going to pass natural gas through this thing. And so he was a very careful person, but he was also kind of an artist when it came to that. And you did this while laying upside down and backwards in a hole. So he did that. My mother was in the restaurant business. And then when I came along, she left work, you know, and we had the traditional family kind of thing where dad went to work and mom stayed home.
Let's
I
get back to fair. What specifically about the 360-ness, if that's a word, of the fair did you respond to?
It was this sense of immersion that you didn't get in being involved in a regular theatrical experience, like in a proscenium style play, or even in a theater in the round experience, because of the vibe that you had from the audience. In a fair environment, you are literally in the audience and you incorporate the audience. It is such a different experience because you're involving them. They are part of the show. If you ignore them, you do that at your peril.
Do you
It's so
remember the
fun.
first time or the first way that you personally went up to a customer or somebody in the fair and interacted with him?
I have no idea. I can't even remember because it's been so long ago.
Well,
Um,
let's go with the
so
first time you remember as a fair participant going up to somebody and saying, "God, you good den," and
I think one of my favorite memories. It was something that there's no way we'd get away with it nowadays. When we were in Agora, there were these trees that used to overhang the road. And we used to go down into the stream and get little pebbles and wash them. And then we would climb as far up as a tree as we could, and we would wait until a passerby passed us by with an open glass of beer. And we would bombardier that glass of beer with a pebble, and it would go plop into the glass of beer. And then we would scale down the trees like Robin and his merry men and demand a tax.
Do you remember what your spiel was? Like stand and deliver, or we
Yeah,
are the
pretty much. Yeah, it was like, yo ho, your ale has been cited and you must now pay the toll. Stand and deliver, man. Stand and deliver. And all of us with little skinny lads with wispy beards. And I think that we were so charmingly adolescent, they could not help but give us their draft of fine Budweiser. And we'd go saunter off and go find a stage and fall asleep on a hay bale or something. And kids, don't ever do that. You shouldn't do that. That's not good.
I was interviewing Dawn Taylor, and she had a similar spiel to cajole beer out of, and she told the story. It was just after she turned 18. It was something about she would give the patron one rock and give the patron another rock and said, "Here, I'll hold your beer." And while, oh yeah, I see you anticipate how this story ends. But again, being cute and 17 or 18 can get you out of a lot of things that otherwise could be problematic.
Well, I think here's the key. As I approach codgerhood, I think I might be coming around the bend and could start getting away with stuff again. So I think this next weekend, I'm going to go find a couple of rocks and see how it works. I'm going to thank you, Don Taylor, for this great idea. I'm going to go find a couple of rocks and see how it works and say, here, hold this rock. Now, here, let me hold your beer for you. There, here.
She found it worked best when there was like a collection of guys. The guys who were with the person who was handing over his beer thought it was hilariously funny. And so you had this built-in audience sort of making it a joke on him, and he had no other choice but to play along.
Well, I mean, that's the nature of it, is because then you don't play along, then you're the goat. And that's brilliant. That's genius.
We've sort of gotten off track. What is the first sort of theatrical thing the fair, quote unquote, hired you to do?
So I was in the Friends of Fair to start with, and I
Right.
was there all through my high school years. My high school job, you've actually had my high school boss on here as an interviewee, and that's Linda Sutherland. Linda hired me when I was 10 years old to work in her magic shop. And what a great job for a kid, right? So
And she was, yeah, that's right. She was in Rialto, right?
Yeah, she lived in Colton, which is like the next town
right
over. Their shop was in Colton, she and Steve, and their son Gary's just a little younger than me. So I worked for them in their various different magic shops and joke shops over the years. In fact, as for many years, I was still on the books. So anytime I was between gigs, I would just call Linda up, and she'd just put me on the schedule, which was great. It was such a luxury to have that as a fallback. In fact, we refer to Linda as Steve, and Steve is my sparens. And Linda has a ring that she still wears that my mother gave her. It's a twin of a ring that was my mom's. And but I digress.
No, that's kind of what this thing's about.
Yeah. So when I got out of high school, I got a phone call from my friend Simon Barley, who had played Ebenezer Scrooge. Called me up and he said, "Hey, I just got this gig at this medieval dinner theater in Orange County that just opened, and they're looking for somebody who can do fire magic. Can you do fire magic?" And I said, "Of course I can do fire magic," because that's the rule of theater. Is if they ask you, "Can you play the Star Spangled Banner on the bagpipes while riding a unicycle backwards? You say, yes, of course I can. And then you go buy a unicycle and take bagpipe lessons. I called my mom and said, hey, let's go to lunch in Hollywood. And so we went to Hollywood Magic and had a nice Chinese lunch. And I bought some props and then went home and wrote some copy. Went and auditioned at Medieval Times when they were very first opening. And I finally got the gig. So that year I couldn't go to fair that much because I was working every weekend. That was the only year I didn't go to fair pretty much every single day. But then when the fair moved to San Bernardino, that was kind of when I entered the entertainment department in 1988. Greg Bell said that he was retiring from the role of Will Shakespeare. And so they had an open casting call. And I was then 20 at that point. And so I went with all of the brass that a 20-year-old could have to audition for the role of Will Shakespeare, along with a bunch of other hopefuls, and gave it my best shot. And just before we were done with the audition, Greg Bell showed up and decided that he wasn't going to quit after all.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes, please.
When you were at Medieval Times, know somebody called Randall Scott?
I think I might have done.
Because I interviewed him and he talked about Medieval Times.
He might have been there after me, though.
Okay.
I wasn't there for very long. I was only there for about 18 months.
Okay.
Off and on. I was there for a period of time and then I left and then I came back. I came back in the courtyard of crests and crafts, selling things.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. So
no, that's okay. So
the audition didn't go so well for Will Shakespeare. So what happened then?
Well, the audition actually went pretty well, but Greg's went better because he already was doing. The casting decision was being made by Jeff Markle, who was playing the Lord Mayor. He decided that, well, they couldn't cast me as Shakespeare, obviously. They didn't want me to just go away. So they said, we want you to play a non-speaking constable in the Lord Mayor's and the Queen's show. And the powers that be said, you don't have any lines and you don't have enough stage time to warrant a pass. So you need to go and find a booth job to get a pass, and you can still be in the show, but you have to get your own pass.
Is this around the same time you had your first conversation with your dad about the fair?
A little before that, yes. Yeah. I went over and Adam Reed had the juggling school. I already knew how to juggle, so Adam gave me a job. And so I would teach and hawk for the school and then run off and do the Lord Mayor's Parade and the Lord Mayor's Show and the Queen's Parade and the Queen's Show. Then the next year, I didn't have that gig anymore, so kind of at odd ends. And I was walking around workshops, and this play that I had watched in a girl was rehearsing, and it was the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. And DJ Carlisle was the director, and it was great. And I loved that show. I loved watching it. It was fantastic. And I was just watching the rehearsal, and DJ was sitting there, and it was the old Dury Creek, which actually had a creek that ran underneath it. And it was on a kind of like had a hillside. And we were sitting there watching the rehearsal, and he looked over at me and he goes, "Are you just watching?" And I said, "Yes, if I may." And he goes, "Certainly. Do you have a gig?" And I said, "Nope." And he goes, "Do you need a gig?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Are you an actor?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Would you like to understudy every male part in this show except for Dr. Faustus?" And I said, "Sure." And so I became the company understudy.
Can you recall who was in that company?
Well, it was Klein L. Jackson as Dr. Faustus, And George, whose name I can never pronounce, won't say it. It's Greek, and I always mispronounce it as Mephistopheles. But then the LHC made him an offer to be the Spanish ambassador, and he took it. Oh, and let me think. Eric Bender and Dan Briggs were our clowns, and Margit, now Schmidt, but Margit Eland was Helena Troy, and Tal Taliason, Taffer, Jeff Smith was in that. Anyway, so basically from one day to the next, I went from being the company understudy to playing Mephistopheles. I ended up doing that all that season, and it was phenomenal. It was like a real shaping event in my fair career because it showed me that I could do a lot and I was capable of doing a lot and kind of put me on the radar. So then the next year, the show didn't come back. So I went to sue. We'd always had an agreement that if the year I didn't get a show, I would come into St. Cuthbert. And so I did. And I stayed in Cuthbert's for a couple of years and then went from Cuthbert's. A friend of mine said, you know, you would probably be really good in the Puritans. And I thought, I can't see it myself, but okay. And so I went and I auditioned. And at that time, The Puritans was being directed by Gerald Zapata and Sherman Kahn, who basically were the founders. And so I went and I auditioned and I got in. Then Sherman went to go work as a lawyer in Japan, and Gerald went to work for the office. So Pam Robertson took over as the director, and she was director for about 2 years. And then she decided that she didn't want to commute back and forth from San Francisco anymore. And so she called me up and said, Tag, you're it. And I
Can
was
I
like,
stop you
well,
for a sec?
yeah, sure.
A question occurred to me, and so we're going to back up in time a little bit, back to your days at the juggling school.
Oh, sure.
Did you find that approaching a patron and teaching them juggling at the fair, how did that compare to approaching a customer in a retail environment outside of fair? How did those feelings compare to each other?
It's interesting because, in a way, the retail environment I was in was different than perhaps other people's retail environment, because when you work in, let's say, a grocery store or clothing store, something like that, somebody comes to your store because they need something. They come to a magic shop because they need a magic trick. They're not going to perish because they don't have a vanishing silk handkerchief. They
Okay.
might die because they don't have food. So there's a certain pressure when they walk in the door of a place that sells food or clothing or things like that. Whereas when they come into a what I'll call an impulse store, you appeal to them on a different level. You kind of have to meet them where they are. I think in an impulse environment, you let them come to you. You kind of open up and kind of meet them part way. You kind of try to figure out what brought them to you. Then you go to them, bring them the rest of the way to where you are. So, like, if it's juggling, you find out where, like, one of the things I used to do when I was hawking juggling was try to bring them into the fun of it. So I would take a single ball and I would wait until I'd spy somebody who was just kind of like looking around and not focused. And I would throw that ball so it would go in an arc and land right at their feet. And they'd go, what? This thing just kind of happened out of nowhere, this magic moment. And they would reach down, they'd pick up the ball and they'd look around, and there I'd be standing with 2 other balls in my hand. Without saying a word, I'd motion them to throw the ball back. Sometimes they'd haul back and like really beat me with it. But
9 times out of 10, they're going to
yeah, 9
toss it.
times out of 10, they'd kind of just toss it back. And if it was a great toss, you'd let it fall in the pattern and you go ahead and juggle it. If it wasn't a great toss, you'd kind of look at them, let it fall, and you look at them and go, ah. And then you toss yours to them in order to show them how to toss. And so you create this rapport by so doing that you're halfway there already. And they're going, I'm having a good time already. And then by that point, now I can talk to them. I'm going, look, you're halfway there already. Why don't you just come on in? Let's finish up your lesson. That sounds great. Let's do that.
But that brings up another point of this podcast, is that FAIR gave us an audience predisposed to play with us.
I agree. I thought it was interesting. There was an article in the Smithsonian magazine, I think it was a couple of years ago, and they were talking about how, in many ways, the Renaissance fairs, when they were first developed, were kind of an antidote to Disneyland as it was then, where everything was prepackaged and sterilized and safe. And that there was always a whiff of the romance and the danger and the occult in Renaissance fairs. And occult in a mysterious, we'll use the word mysterious.
Or exotic.
Exotic, a whiff of the romantic and exotic. And it was that sense of play, I think, more than anything, that pulls you into that. You don't get much of that in a theme park environment. I think we don't get as much of that now at fairs as we used to, but we still get more of it than we would any other place. I taught a workshop for a while that was called environmental theater. And one of the points I used to make is that when you walk down the street at the fair, we make eye contact with people, with the audience. Modern people on the street don't tend to do that because it feels dangerous.
I would like to hear about things you have written at FAIR and your transition from character actor to theme character / writing stuff.
My first attempt to write anything for the fair was back in the late 80s when the fair was still in Devore. I had, of course, seen all the great shows at Agora, Reduced Shakespeare, Commedia La Bomba Bomba, and Dr. Faustus, of course. And this was before I was actually in Faustus. I sat down to write a play, and I wrote a comedic slapstick version of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And the trouble was I couldn't get any traction on it at the fair. And so I decided that, like all professional actors, you've got to try it in the provinces first. So I took it out to some of the small fairs. At that time, there was a little fair down in San Marcos, California, which is near San Diego. So we took it down there to try it out, and a couple of places. And it went over okay, but it was not a good play. It was not good at all. I thought it was funny as heck, but it wasn't apparently very funny. There was
Who was in that show?
It was just myself and my companion at the time, named Carol, and my friend Mike Parker, who now lives in North Carolina, and my friend James Monroe, who still lives in Southern California. And it was just the four of us, complete with men dressed as women and a stuffed severed head and, just really goofiness. One must recall that this was the era of when Leslie Patterson was directing the entertainment department. And there were certain bridges one did not cross.
So anyway, you're at the San Marcos Fair.
Yeah, and we found out that it was only just so okay. And so we gave that up as a bad job. And then I ended up in Dr. Faustus, and that was good. And I didn't end up writing anything for a very long time, but I ended up in a lot. So I had been in the Puritans for quite some time. I ended up directing the Puritans for a while.
When you were director of the Puritans and during workshops and somebody came up to you and said, tell me about being a Puritan at fair, what was your set spiel? And were you able to sense if they would work out and what were clues that they were?
I think the best description of what a Puritan's job is came from that same former companion. She said that a Puritan's job is to go out and preach against sin in a way that makes you want to run right out and commit one. Our job is to lose. If the Puritan doesn't lose, then Everybody else doesn't win. Your job is the killjoy because that makes everybody else have a better time. You can't have light without dark. You can't have joy without sadness. The contrast is what makes it better.
How did
And
you audition people to figure out if they were?
we generally had an open call. In those days, on the first weekend of workshops, all the guild masters who were holding auditions would stand up there on the big stage and they would say, you know, we are the guild of such and such.
So what
Uh,
did you say?
I would say, you don't mind going out and being vehement for the Lord. If you don't mind going out there and being righteous and telling all them sinners how wrong they are, looking them dead in the eye and being right all the time, then come see us. And maybe we'll determine that you're holy enough. Maybe.
And then
Something like
you
that.
exited to a lot of booze and catcalls.
Oh, yeah, there was generally booze.
Yeah.
With the Puritans, there was always booze.
What did you have them do as an audition piece or?
Auditions generally included things like you had to open a Bible to a random passage, read it aloud, and then preach on it. I rigged my audition. I made sure that my Bible was upside down and read my passage in gibberish first and then preached on it because it was funnier that way. I knew that my improv was probably not as strong as some of the other people I was up against. So I knew that if I was going to stand a chance, I had to be funnier. Then I wasn't clever, so I better be funny. And it worked. Also, we were real short of men, so I think that was also in my favor. There was that. We would do some theater games to see how fast they were on the uptake, because that's also something you have to do as a Puritan. You have to be quick.
Do you remember what those games were?
You know, I really don't at this point.
Okay, that's fine.
I wish I did.
It,
I don't remember now what all we used to do.
do you remember what percentage of people passed the auditions, or did you accept pretty much everybody? And
Well, the first year, I made the mistake of pretty much taking everybody that showed up. And that I learned very quickly was a mistake because my guild became massive. It was that first year I had like 22 people. And that was a mistake because that's just too many people. It's unmanageable. Even if not everybody's there all the time, you don't build that kind of tight, single minded, focused group that a group like the Puritans needs to be. So I had a lot of the old timers who, by the end of that run, got very fed up with me. So they left me. And a lot of the new folks felt that they weren't getting the experience they thought they'd signed on for. And so they left. And so we went from 22 to 6. I had 6 real stalwarts that stuck. The next year, we got 2 more. So we were 8 mighty, focused, angry Puritans. And that year, we came out the gate like God's own fire. It was majestic. We went back to first principles. We were focused. We were hungry. We were lean. We created some of the best angry theater in the world. And we also created some of the best stupid theater in the world, too. I mean, that was, if memory serves, that's the year I dressed Bryce Byerly up as a dancing bear and gave him to the Queen, which is a whole story unto itself.
can I tell you a story that just suddenly popped up into my mind about Puritans?
Please.
One of the best Puritan bits I remember seeing one weekend, there was supposed to be the end of the world on Saturday in the mundane world.
Right.
And so that Sunday, when the world still exists, there was this poor little Puritan. I think she was like 16 years old, and she had hand painted a sign that said, "This is embarrassing." And to me, that was perfect. I
Yeah,
mean, it was one simple prop. She didn't have to do anything except to look a little sad and forlorn. I mean, it was brilliant for most impact for least amount of work
I
that you
love
could.
that kind of thing. the The cool part about the rapture, which comes around about every 5 years, historically the rapture didn't actually become doctrine until the 1850s, but who's counting? But
That would be truly being too concerned with being, period.
oh yeah, I mean the thing is, again, we have to meet the audience where they are. They're going to understand the concept of the rapture more than they're going to understand something like the Brownists. To get back to your question about the writing thing, so I was up being a Puritan at Black Point, and Gerald Zapata was playing the Lord Sheriff. He had an unfortunate situation where he had to leave for a weekend. And so they came and they said, could you possibly step in as the Lord Sheriff for this weekend? And so I got the script and I had to learn Lord Mayor's and Queen show in a real quick hurry. And so, fortunately, because I had a background in theater, I was able to learn the script real quick. I had a real good time doing that. And I decided that maybe that's what I'd like my next step to be. So I called Gerald up and said, hey, if the opening for Lord Sheriff ever comes up, I'd kind of like to be considered for the role. And then when the fair moved from Black Point to the Nut Tree, and Gerald went into the office all the time, well, that opportunity presented itself. So I got a phone call, and Gerald said, well, you asked, and I'm telling you, if you'd like that part, it's yours. And so went up to Vacaville, was the sheriff up there. It was a very different experience being a villain who still got to lose, but you're actually a villain with a little bit of power. It was a little different of kind of experience. Plus, I had foil because they decided that the sheriff needed a wife. And so Sue Honor, of course, had been the wife of every lead male character for years. So they decided that Will Wood, as Captain Francis Drake, would be the mayor because Drake had been the honorary mayor of Plymouth at one point. So to streamline things, Francis Drake became the mayor of Chipping under Roguewood, which we still were at the time. And I, Toby Scratchit, became the Lord High Sheriff, and Phoebe Fennegue became Phoebe Scratchit, my wife. That began a pattern that pertained for years. And Sue and I played a married couple for the next several years. We were like the battling bickers. It was a different kind of villain. I got to be this kind of low key villain, this growly villain. I didn't have to be in your face all the time. And I remember one time someone came up and we were having lunch. One of the servers came up and we had audience right there. And one of the servers came up, asked Phoebe, what would the Lord Sheriff have on his luncheon plate? And Phoebe said, oh, give my lord some bread and cheese. He has the heart of a peasant. And I said, yeah, I keep it in a jar under the porch. So it was like that. It was this kind of very low key, very growly villain. But all in all, it was still a villain. And I'd been a bad guy for so long. And so eventually that started to wear a little thin after 10 years between Puritans and this. And one day Phoebe looked at me and she said, You you do not look like a happy man. What's up with you? And I told her, I said, I don't know. I just don't feel I'm not feeling it. I'm just not feeling it anymore. It's hard to get excited. And she goes, well, what would make you excited again? I said, I don't know. Maybe I'd like to be a good guy for a change. And she goes, well, what kind of good guy do you want to be? I said, I don't know, maybe the mayor. Sue said, well, then you're going to have to talk to Gerald. And so I did. I went and talked to Gerald. And he said, well, you're going to have to talk to Will. I went to Will because, I mean, if you're going to take a guy's part, you got to talk to him about it first. And Will, being Will, who's one of my favorite human beings on the planet, he responded in classic Will Wood style with, just glad to be on the team, boss. So I became Sir Toby Scratchit, the Lord Mayor. And it took me a season to figure out what the heck I was doing as mayor. But when I did, it became the most fun I'd had in years. My guiding light became Julie McCoy from Love Boat. I became the cruise director of the fair. I would walk up to audience members and inquire of them what they had seen, what they liked about the fair, what they wanted to see, and then I would give them suggestions of places to go and things to do and ways to enjoy the fair. And I got to play everybody's drunk uncle. It was great. So Toby was constantly just a little bit off the beam. Just a little, you know. So it was great. Just marvelous. And I did that for several years. Then I needed to change again because at that point, I think I had kind of decided I wasn't going to do fair anymore, that I was going to step out. But then spring came and the siren call, and it's hard to change the habit of a lifetime. I called up the office, and at that point, the office was being run by Carlos Penaranda. And I said, I kind of like my job back, please. And he said, well, I'm sorry, your job doesn't exist anymore. What we're going to do, and this was an election year, and by that point, Gerald had left, and they had a new entertainment director. Her name was Maggie Savoyle, and they were holding an election for mayor. This was an interesting idea because even though it's not historically something that would have happened, because mayors were appointed, what they did was they had ballot boxes all over the fair, and they encouraged the audience to vote for their candidate. And there were 4 candidates that were running on the ballot. And so there was Thaddeus Foote, which was Dennis Michael, and Jenny Beals Wright, and Wiley Withers, and Greg Jones. They were playing a pair of brothers who were running together as one candidate because that's how smart they were. The 2 guys that were just smart enough to run together. They were a pair of pig farmers. And Don Lorenzo de Coranzano, the harbor master, was Tom Metcalf, is Italian.
They added you to the list of candidates, or?
No, they did not. Maggie called me up and said, they say you want to come back. And I said, I do. And she goes, well, could I interest you in doing something different? Would you consent to be the brewmaster? Because what we'd like to do is we'd like to have, by that point, they decided that we were no longer chipping under Oakwood. We were now the town of Port Deptford, and we were going to be this international hub. And they wanted to create all these international characters. They wanted the brewmaster to be the same actor every year, but to be a different nationality. And so Maggie found out that I kind of have this knack for dialects. And so the first year, he was Herr Friedrich Pfaffenpjugen. He was a German. And it was great. And my friend Darian Davis played my wife, I'm a Pfaffenpjugen. And she is a very gifted clown. She actually went to clown conservatory. And so she played my wife in a push-up bodice looking like a St. Pauli girl with a pair of great big tankards.
Did she have ponytails?
Yeah, she did. Yeah, a great big ponytails. Yeah, and a great big pair of tankards. And like that. And it was great. And we did.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch her name.
That's my name, yeah.
No, your wife's actress' name.
Her name, Darian DeVries.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And she was playing I'm a Pfaffenpjuken, and I was Heinrich Pfaffenpjuken, because she would say, "Oh, where's my little Heine?" Yeah, so it was very silly. And then the next year we were Scottish. It's always a vomit joke. It's
It's
the
nice when you have a
yeah.
tradition like that.
We were the Far From Pukins, and then we were the McHurleys. We were the McHurleys. When we were Germans, I would do all the talking, and she would just answer. Everything was yeah, yeah. You know, she didn't speak hardly at all. Then when we became Scots, I became almost unintelligible in this great big, really broad Glaswegian thing. And she had this very cultured kind of Edinburgh accent, that kind of classic, high, kind of Scottish thing that's got like kind of high lilt to it, like that. And my was a way about Glasgow thing, you know, like that. She would be the interpreter, and by that point, we were no longer playing husband and wife. We were playing identical twins. She was my identical twin sister. So we were Angus and more Angus McHowley. And then the next year, she went away to clown conservatory. So at that point, they decided they didn't want a brewmaster anymore, but they didn't want to ditch the Angus McHurley character because it had started to get really funny, and Maggie liked it. So I learned to speak English and I became a barber surgeon, and I became Angus McHurley, God's gift to medicine. Um, and that was great. I had a wee jar, and it had some banana peels in alcohol. It was my leeches, and people would come up and they'd say, "What in the hell is that?" I go, this is the finest stable of healing leeches in Europe. This one is big joke, and this one is wee joke, and this one is no as big as big joke, but no as wee joke. And this one is Daft Willie. No, I'm not gonna tell you where I put him because there's ladies present. But if it stays hard for more than 4 hours, tell everybody. It was a lot of fun. I liked being the brewmaster. And what was fun was I got to do it again later on. The Coronaburg Renaissance Fair, when they changed their dates at last, when their founder, Tom, had passed away, and they changed the dates so that it no longer overlapped with Southern Fair. I got a phone call from their head of beverage, and they asked if I would come and run their pub crawl. And it's a German themed fair. So I got to bring back my German brewmaster, and I ran the pub crawl. And at that fair, they don't have a king or a queen. They have the Baron von Laffer. And he is Heinrich von Laffer, played by Chuck Spittler, because we didn't want to confuse people with having two Heinrichs. I became Friedrich.
Oh, I can see how
that. Yeah, it's confusing. Two Heinies? Two Heinies in charge? That would be insane, because people really care, about that.
They would just walk out when they realized there were two of you because they are that discerning.
Yeah, because two round guys named Heinrich would really confuse them. So I became Friedrich Fur from Puken.
I have another question.
But yeah, so that was Corona, and
I have questions since you've been in so many fair shows. What is your various impression of the ladies who have played the queen? And what does it take to be a good queen that you have seen?
It's what's interesting to me is every actress I've ever seen who's played Queen Elizabeth brings their own particular thing to the role. When I first started fair at Southern Fair, it was Louisa Puig. I will always think of Louisa, and she has a very special place in my heart because she is the BBC Queen. There's a thing I still do to this day. Whenever the Queen, whatever fair we're at, comes by, and when she's out of earshot, and I'm just there with the audience, I'll go, oh, she looks just like she does on the money, but she's much bigger than I thought she was going to be tiny. Louisa looks just like she does on the money. It was when I was a kid, I was like, good Lord, she looks just like Elizabeth I. When she arrived, your knee didn't have a choice.
No.
It was going to kneel, and when she stood you up, you stood. It was that simple. I can't hear the golden speech and not well up. It's
Hmm.
just something that is rooted in my hind brain. She was what what the queen was supposed to be. And then Athene Mahalicus, she was every bit Henry VIII's daughter. When you were with her, you never doubted for a minute she was a tutor. And then Galen was just jolly all the time. I didn't get a lot of time with Victoria, who came next, Victoria Hanlon. I actually did. I got to spend some time with Victoria, and she was sweet. She was a very sweet girl who got kind of thrown into the role, not really knowing what she was in for. But once she was there, I think she really did very well and has the distinction of being the only actress we've ever had who was actually English. I loved working with her, and I got to actually direct her in the Queen show, because that was the next thing I did. Was I eventually, they let me write one. They let me write a Queen show, which was crazy stuff, and direct one, which was nuts. I got to direct a Queen show and a Lord Mayor show one time, and that was probably one of my favorite things of all time. And I still have people that come up to me and say that it was their very favorite.
What was
Um,
unique about your Queen show?
with the Queen show, it wasn't that it was unique so much, it was that I went back and found old things. Kind of being a historian and a traditionalist, I went back and found old stuff that we lost, and I put back in pageants, and I put back in the peasants, and I put back in military pageantry, and I put back in a lot of stuff that had gotten lost over the years. We brought back having a duel in the middle of the show. In a lot of ways, it was kind of a throwback to the Queen shows of my youth. I'm proud that at least we got to have one more of those. Not to do the whole "it was better back then" thing, because the fair is constantly reinventing itself. The fair is new every single day, and it needs to be. It can't stay the same, because if it stays the same, it will die. And it's funny, now that I'm up here in the great Pacific Northwest, the fair up here is a whole different animal. It is not anything like the fairs in California. They have no memory of those. It grew up in its own environment. It has its own history and its own legends and its own stories. As
Well, then
somebody
let me
who,
ask you, we met last weekend at the Canterbury Renaissance Fair in Silverton. And it's not better, not worse, but it's just how is it different from somebody who's more familiar with a fair down in Southern California?
it is its own animal. I mean, it is a homegrown fair for a start. What's intriguing about it is a family fair, private land owned by a woman named Nancy White. The site manager is one of her daughters. The other site manager is her other daughter, who also plays the queen. They run the whole show.
I would
I
like to
mean, it's
say that I liked it, wandering
it. I have a
around.
great time there. I do. I have a great time. It's a small but intense audience. But like I was saying, the fairs up here in the Pacific Northwest are their own animal, their own unique flavor.
How would
Not
you what adjective would you apply to a Oregon fair before you would apply it to a California fair?
There is a much higher fantasy element. I will give you that. Um,
There did seem to be a lot more pirates and a lot more elves.
there's a lot more fairies, a lot more pirates, a lot more elves. Um,
And I noticed that for some of the women's costumes, they seem to be more like Elizabethan in cut, but like 17th century in fabric kind of thing.
You know what? I've always had the maxim that, you know what, if you bought a ticket to come
Right.
into the fair, you can wear whatever you want.
I agree 110%. So, John Breen, what other irons do you have in the Renaissance fire?
While I was doing all these other things for entertainment, I was kind of moonlighting on the side in one of the longest lived Renaissance fair bands of all time that has outlived, I think, every other band ever, that is coming up on 30 years, still going, and that is the world famous Poxy Boggards. As I was an active member of that band for over 20 years and was on 6 albums, I think, 6 or 7 albums. Um,
Can I give you my musician question then? And I
yeah,
got this from
sure.
Mark Sellen.
Yeah,
It
please.
seems that every musical act has to balance being period versus being entertaining to a modern audience. Where for you and the Poxy Boggarts is that line?
That's a great question. When the Boggarts first started, um, the music was very, very period, and um, there were a lot of empty hay bales. As that needle moved further and further away from period music, well, the benefit that the Boggarts had was the ability to do rude material. That was the both the blessing and the curse. There's an effort to keep it in period themes, if not in a period style. They don't write songs about NASCAR necessarily. You know, there might be some modern tunes on a CD because, like, we've written country songs and we've written some rock tunes, but we don't do those at the fair. There, it's all songs about drinking and women and failing to get women, because that's the rule of being a boggart, is that you are a lovable loser, but you're a lovable loser. You
Can
know,
I
we don't.
interrupt for a second and
Sure.
tell you my most favorite Bogart song? And
Oh,
if you
please.
told me you wrote it or had a hand in writing it, I will get down on my hands and knees and genuflect. I love the burlap song.
I had no hand in burlap. I cannot take any credit for burlap. That was written by, as far as I know, that was written by Stu Venable and Bill Roper. That was one of the early Bogart songs. That was already there when I, like, my the title of my autobiography someday, it was on fire when I got there. What I love is that song is as it's evergreen. We've re-recorded that song probably 4 times. It just comes back about every 6 years or so, and we re-record it with whatever the voices we have are at the time, just because we want it as a snapshot, along with Agincourt. That's the other song that is for us evergreen. We will do always do Agincourt Carol, and I love that song so much.
Could you
Um,
sing a bit of that song to remind me of
which
what's
one? Long Live
Agincourt?
the Burlap Wave or
Oh,
Agincourt?
yeah, Agincourt.
Oh, well, my voice ain't what it was, but I'll do what I can. Our king went forth to Normandy with grace and might of chivalry. God for him wrought marvelously, wherefore our king may call and cry. He set the siege soothful to say to Harfleur town with royal array. The town he won and made a fray, that France may rue until doomsday. Deo gratias, Deo gratias, Anglia, redebro victoria. That's the baritone part, I think. Something like. It's kind of an approximation.
I was thoroughly entertained. I had no idea you had been in the Poxy Boggarts.
Some of the guys are just songwriting machines. Stu Venable is a songwriting machine. Bill Roper is a songwriting machine. The Schwadron brothers, Stephen and Phil, who are identical twins, are just monsters. They're like George and Ira. 25 years, I wrote one song. And it was a kind of a sea song that I wrote. We were knocking around with the idea not when like this recent craze for sea shanties came along, but way back when pirates started becoming a big thing. We tinkered with the idea of doing a pirate album. Occasionally we think of doing theme albums, and we've done a couple. But we were thinking of doing a pirate album. So I thought, oh, well, I'll write a pirate song. And so I started messing around with this tune. So I wrote this coming of age song about a boy running off to sea. And it was called Up and Away in the Morning, or just Up and Away. It's all about a young man running off to sea and sailing off to Jamaica. He decides that living a life at sea is the best thing that he could possibly have, and that someday put him in a lead weighted coffin and throw him overboard, because that's where he wants to be.
I'm going to ask you to think about this for a sec. Give me which 5 songs give you the greatest joy to sing with the Poxy Boggarts.
The song that locks me in every time and tells me we're going to work. When we get ready to work as a group, we get in a circle and we sing Jolly Red Nose a cappella. And that's when we're ready to go to work. It's the song that just kind of puts us all in the right headspace. I don't know why. It's just the song. Of all the birds that ever I see, the owl is the fairest in her degree. For all the day long she sits in a tree, and when the night comes, away flies she. To wit, to woo, to whom drinkst thou, Sir Knave, to thee? This song is well sung, and I make you a vow, for he is a knave that drinketh thou. Nose, nose, jolly red nose, and who gave thee that jolly red nose? Cinnamon and ginger, nutmeg and cloves, and that gave me that jolly red nose. We've been singing that song for 30 years. Songs that I love to do, Jolly Red Nose. I'd have to be a liar if I didn't say Up and Away is way up there. It means a lot to me when we do it, partly because I wrote it. It means it's just cool, And I will say it was surreal, when streaming music became a thing. The first time I figured out that the Poxy Boggarts were on Spotify and I put it on, and the first song was Up and Away, to listen to that coming through your car stereo, that was cool. Another one would be New York Girls, is another one that I absolutely love singing. And we didn't write that one. That one's a traditional piece. Gray Funnel Line is, I'd mentioned that one. That one's actually, people think it's traditional, but it's not. It's actually was written by Cyril Tawney in, I think, the 1970s.
Do you do that out at fair and just make it sound Elizabethan-y enough?
Yeah, you know what? It's one of those songs that's got enough harmony that most people don't even realize it's not. That's one of those quiet end of day songs that we kind of sneak in. It's not one that we would do on the Rogues Reef, because it's not lively. There's always a set toward the end of the day that's kind of quiet, and it's mostly just attended by other fair performers. The audience is off somewhere else, but Great Fun Lines are like one of those real quiet songs. Don't mind the rain or the rolling sea. The weary night never worries me. But the hardest part of a sailor's day is to watch the sun as it dies away. It's one more day on the gray funnel line. And it goes like that, but it's hard to nail down 5, because there's so very many. If I had to come up with a 5th one, I mean, Agincourt's way up there.
What would be the last song you would sing in your ideal set of songs that gave you joy?
For a song to go out on, I would say that if we were closing out a set and it was going to be the end of a fair day, I would say we'd go out with burlap. That would that would be it. That's how you end the day.
Well, I wouldn't complain.
Yeah.
I'm kind of running out of things to say. When you were kind enough to say, yeah, let's do this, was there something that you thought of at that point where you said to yourself, got to be sure to mention X, Y, and Z? So this is your opportunity, if you haven't said it already, to mention an X, Y, and a Z.
I am going to be forever grateful for I know it sounds, like kind of trite, but I'm just so grateful to all the people that I've known over the years, and the moments that I've had over the years. Um, just being able to be out there on that stage or in that audience, in the streets of the fairs, wherever those fairs are, and just the from gigantic moments like being in the middle of the stage during a Queen show when just these massive cinematic moments where the world stands still and you could hear a pin drop, to just these hurly burly times and like some of my favorite and like the most treasured things I have, or moment or memories that I have, are like when there's not a lot that fair can do for you. I mean, like the most they can't really give you a pay raise as such, and they can't really give you a better parking spot, or there's not an employee of the month. But once in a while, there's some kind of something they can do for you. And one of those things is that, at least at Southern Fair, Northern too, sometimes people get chosen to be knighted. And it was during a Queen show, when I was the mayor, and I was starting to leave the stage. And I was making my exit up center, and Danwell McCann was playing Will Shakespeare at the time, and he kind of, and he's a big lad. He's like 6'3". And he got in front of me and he wouldn't let me off the stage. And I was like, Denny, I gotta go. The Queen suddenly went, and it was Galen Kirkpatrick. And she said, Sir Toby Scratchit, we would have a word with thee before you go. And I turned around and I thought, what in the heck have I done? And they called me out, and she'd said it kind of sternly. And she said, come here, sirrah, and kneel. And so I swept down center and I picked a knee. And she says, is there any man here who would give me a sword? And every man wearing steel on that stage reached. But Will Wood got there first. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little choked up.
That's okay.
That's just something you can't buy a moment like that. You just can't.
Well, it's like one of those everything coming together at once kind of moments.
It is. It really is. And it's it's that time where you know that you did it all right, and that No matter what else, you made the right choice all those years ago when you walked in that gate, and I looked up and I watched J. Paul Moore on that gate all those years ago. And I said, that's what I want to do. And I walked in that gate and I said, this is the place. This is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. And this is going to be the work that I do for the rest of my life. And it has been. And it's the work that I do, and it's the work that my family does. I've met some of the best people of my life at a Renaissance fair. And I still do. And I think that's all I got to say about that.
Well, then I think I'll push the stop recording button.